Okay, so this is a presentation by Christian Hendrick on the threat analysis of Hezbollah for Islamism and Terrorism uh, by Professor Keyes. Background of Hezbollah is during the Lebanon Civil War that started in 1979. The war basically started because of an influx of Palestinians that were uh, moved out of what is now sovereign Israel and they moved into Lebanon. Now, Palestinians are uh, Sunni Muslims, whereas a good portion of the people in Lebanon were Shia Muslims. So this influx of population of Shia Muslims uh, led to them having more power, and with the Christian sect that was in Beirut at the same time, and the Druze, it escalated into a full-on civil war that basically turned the entire area upside down. Um, but there was a lot going on during this period of time, especially 1975 to 1979, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Um, right now, we'll get into the Iranian Revolution. The reason why Iran is so important to discuss whenever we're talking about Hezbollah is Iran basically created Hezbollah. But the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, where the Shah monarchy was exiled. During this period of time, um, President Carter was influencing a lot of what was going on in Iran, uh, more for political reasons, but it was also the spread of democracy that was going on during this period of time. Um, because communism was so bad during the Cold War era. So um, the Shah monarchy tried to in place Western style rules on the people there in Iran. And basically, it was be Western or die. So eventually, the secularists and the religious uh, leaders in the mosques joined together, and they found Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been exiled previously from Iran and resided in the United Kingdom because he actually spoke out against the Shah monarchy. Well, the secularists and the religious fundamentalists joined together and they placed him as the new political leader to come and be part of Iran and establish a new Iranian government. Um, the Ayatollah established a religious government structure that he believed came directly from the Quran. He stated many times that he believed that the Quran and the teachings from the Prophet Muhammad were not just um, for religious use, but for everyday use and should be followed as a governmental rule. So the most prevalent law that is followed even currently in Iran is the Sharia law, and there's been instances where people have tried to revolt, but they control the new religious government controls just about everything that goes on in Iran. But so during this period, the Iranian Revolution happened, and at the same time that the Iranian Revolution was happening, the whole Middle East was just in chaos. Um, in 1979, Saddam Hussein came to power in Iraq. Um, at the same time this was happening, um, the Russians had been uh, they were infiltrating, or they were attacking and trying to seize control of Afghanistan. And during that period, you had individuals from Saudi Arabia uh, flying over to Afghanistan to join the Mujahideen to fight, where the United States was supporting the Mujahideen. It is a very intricate web of what all happened, especially during 1979. Um, yeah, it's just sheer chaos. And at the same time, you still had the uh, Lebanese civil war that was happening. It was chaos. So the reason why or how Hezbollah was created by the Iranian government that was established by Ayatollah Khomeini is the fact that Iran is majority a Shia sect of Islam. They all follow the Shia sect, um, believing that the difference in who should have succeeded the Prophet Muhammad. Um, so, um, as far as in the Muslim world, Shias are the minority. The majority is Sunni, um, and so Ayatollah Khomeini wanted to expand the reaches um, of the Shia sect of Islam. So he looked to Lebanon, where the next largest population of Shia Islams resided. So they started funding money into the Shia Muslims outside of Iran. And the other thing that Iran and Ayatollah Khomeini ran on to um, become the religious leader or the leader of Iran was the fact that the West had so heavily involved itself in the actions of the Shah monarchy. He used this as a pedestal to raise himself up against the Shah. The other country or ethnicity of people that Iranians hate are Jewish people. And the fact that Israel had been established, and there was multiple times where the Arabic neighbors tried to take over the land, and each time the Israelis pushed them back, and so it was just it's a sore spot with the Iranian Muslim community, is not how strong Israel is in the region, even though they are completely outnumbered and surrounded by Muslims. So they the Iranian government started sending money to the Shia Muslims in Lebanon to establish a solid group that could attack back and try and gain um, the the ability to control the area once again. Um, so that's how Iran started Hezbollah, and we'll look a little bit more into that here in a minute. So when Hezbollah became active, the one thing that whenever you're doing research about Shia terrorism versus Sunni terrorism is Shia terrorism, because they are a minority, they seem to have to make a greater stand, but they don't have the numbers to just waste away. They do, but they don't, if that makes sense. So they're willing to sacrifice people if need be, but if they don't have to, they really won't. They're not going to go on a mass suicide bombing spree. But speaking of suicide terrorism, Hezbollah was the first Muslim group to actually start using suicide bombers. If you go back thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, um, there was the Shia assassins that would basically martyr themselves by taking out a Roman official. They didn't have explosives then, so what they would do is they would stab the Roman official and then just wait for the guards to show up, and that was their martyrdom. Um, so they kind of put a 20th century spin on this by attaching explosives, and it completely threw the United States and Israel completely off track. Um, so whenever they became active in 1983, they carried out some terrible attacks in Beirut. One of them was the barracks bombing of the United States Marines, um, and then there was also another one where they attacked the uh, the embassy. It was a federal building. It had CIA individual personnel, FBI, Department of State, you name it, from the United States. They were over there trying to manage the activities of the Civil War to try and mitigate as much problems and to help the people there because there was a huge humanitarian crisis during the Civil War. Um, so Hezbollah carried out those attacks, and because of how surprising they were, they they actually caused the United States to withdraw from Beirut and Lebanon altogether. Officially, the United States left, but the CIA works unofficially, and they still had a presence there. So in 1984, Hezbollah operatives kidnapped the operations chief of station, William Buckley, and held him for roughly 15 months or so before he died because he was being tortured. Um, but they were able to break him psychologically to get information out of him. They brought in a specialist um, that would specialize in psychology and psychiatry, and they completely destroyed his will to fight back mentally and physically. So once Hezbollah got this information, what they started doing is they were able to identify who the spies were and where they worked, and who they reported to, and Hezbollah just started killing them, or they would just disappear. Nobody knows officially what happened to them, but they would just disappear. And this was a really new move for a terrorist organization to do, was kidnap a chief of station uh, of the United States. So Hezbollah, right there between the suicide bombings and the kidnapping, really showed that they were of a different breed than the Sunni Muslim terrorists that we're mostly familiar with today. So Hezbollah has been active for 35 years in Lebanon, and they are they are what a terrorist organization hopes to achieve at one point or another. They are the evolution of what a terrorist organization wants. They want political power, to use fear to manipulate and change the government to their will. So what Hezbollah has achieved is something that only a few other groups have achieved, to where they're actually considered a political party. Um, Hamas is one of them in the Gaza Strip that controls the area and controls the government. Hezbollah, though, has kind of shared the government um, with the Lebanese. They hold seats in parliament. They're able to make laws. They're able to enforce laws. So they're a pseudo member of the government. They join whenever it's appropriate for them, but they they hold that political power. But what they really hold is a paramilitary force that is almost more more in numbers than the Lebanese government actually holds. The actual Lebanese army is about the same size as the Hezbollah fighting force. So that gives them the numbers, but we also are talking about a smaller country, so we're talking maybe the difference of 10, 15, 20,000 soldiers and the difference between who's greater and who's smaller. But it's still something to look at. Um, so the Hezbollah Hezbollah is a proxy for Iran, and since they are so close to Israel, it would be wrong for Iran not to support Hezbollah in attacking Israel, and they do this continuously with Hamas. It's the one thing that the two groups seem to, even though Hamas is Sunni and Hezbollah is Shia, they both agreed that Israel needs to be destroyed. They are not the rightful people to be in Israel, and so therefore they should be removed. Um, so Hezbollah from the north has dug a series of tunnels that you can read about in just the local news of Israel. They're constantly digging tunnels, and Israel is finding them and filling them with cement. It's just back and forth, but Hezbollah will launch rockets very similar to what Hamas will do, and vice versa. But the reason why I put Iran uses Hezbollah as a proxy for its war against Israel in the West, because that's very important, especially with today's climate, with what's going on between the United States and Iran. So I want you to keep that in your mind whenever we're talking about this threat analysis of what they're capable of. So we'll go farther. So Hezbollah's reach is outside of Lebanon, um, and it's really weird, uh, but Hezbollah, because of the displacement of so many Lebanese after and during the civil war, many of them moved away, and they moved away to an area is called the tri-border area officially. But what it is it's a border region that is shared by Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. And you can have there's a vast mix of individuals there, uh, from Russian war criminals to the Hezbollah operatives that are there now. But there's a very mixed and diverse population there. But the Lebanese found a home there, and they've established um, a normal. It's normal to see Lebanese in this region, as well as somebody from Brazil or Argentina or Paraguay. Um, so because there was such a huge following that went um, to this tri-border area, it was easier for Hezbollah to establish a base because and because, like I said, Lebanon had Shia Muslims there. That was the main religion there in that country. So whenever they left and they established a home here in the tri-border area, it made it easy for Hezbollah to move in. And of course, by Hezbollah, you're also getting Iran. So Iran, knowing that there's Shia Muslims in a certain area, they will dump money into it and try and establish a base for that area. And that's what Iran did using Hezbollah in the tri-border area. They've built mosques and they um, use it to as a recruiting area for new members to Hezbollah in the region. But what is really interesting, though, is South America is predominantly made up of Catholics, or Catholicism is the main religion there. Um, because of the Spanish and the Portuguese, that was their main religion whenever they came over during that period of time. Um, so um, it's interesting to see that Shia Muslims were able to establish such a solid base in this region, especially whenever it comes down to how Hezbollah finances themselves in the region. They dabble um, in drugs and stuff like that. And we'll get more into that here in a minute. But those are areas that the drug trafficking organizations or cartels um, are the main forerunners for, and so for them to be able to establish a base and not be attacked by the Catholic cartels, it shows that they're willing to work with people of other religions whenever it meets their needs, which is something that you don't see from Sunni terrorism that often. That ability to break down walls and work with somebody even though they are to a Sunni Muslim or Shia an infidel. Um, so the the relationship with drugs allows Hezbollah to gain financing without Iranian influence. It's their own network. So while it's hard to distinguish between Hezbollah and Iran, it's it's more concerning that Hezbollah is able to independently gain money um, without the use of Iran or its state sponsor. So the tri-border area, the reason why I have it up here on this map between the United States, and I'll get into that here in a minute, but the tri-border area is known for weapons, drugs, computer hacking, smuggling, money laundering, you name it. If it's illicit or a black market trade, you can find it in the tri-border area, which is probably why Hezbollah has found it so easy to make a home there. And they're able to gather whatever they need to make a tap. But on this third point, whenever we think of Islamic terrorism, we typically think of it about a threat that's on the other side of the ocean, either Pacific or Atlantic, but Hezbollah's threat is actually linked. They can drive, if they so chose, from the tri-border area through South America, through Central America, through Mexico, and to the border of the United States, if they wanted to. That should be concerning. And mostly because, I mean, we currently see what's going on with the border, people coming over uh, illegally. I mean, the United States government is trying to shore up that deficit, but it's a hole regardless. Um, so the possible threats from Hezbollah, and I added some from the analysis paper that I just recently did on Hezbollah for this presentation. And the reason why I added some is because there was something that jumped off the page that it was actually concerning, and we'll get down to that in a third point. But Hezbollah is the paramilitary force used by Iran to wage unofficial war through terrorism, and it will likely do the same to the United States, especially with the tensions that are rising between the United States and Iran. So, why that's concerning is because Iran has been seeking nuclear power for many years now. And if they attain it, weapons grade material, not necessarily just um, the nuclear material needed to produce power, which most people think is a ruse, um, to gain weapons grade plutonium or uranium. If they were able to actually develop a nuclear weapon, there is a slight possibility that Iran could smuggle that said device from Iran through its back channels um, and get it to the Hezbollah operatives there in the tribal border area. And then, like I said in the last slide, you could drive it straight up to the southern border. The reason why I don't think that this would really work is because our borders all have radioactive sensors to look for nuclear weapons being crossed. Um, it's really hard to hide a nuclear weapon, something of that magnitude. Um, and if you would need somebody with a specific set of skills um, to travel with the device to make sure that it was handled properly, that nobody was exposed to the radioactive material, making them sick, stuff that could lead to discovery. It would be really difficult because the nuclear physicists aren't exactly the type of people that you would see. Um, they would stand out crossing the border and with a bunch of other Hezbollah operatives that are a little bit more battle hardened. But nothing is completely impossible. Um, but the second one that I wanted to really um, focus on with this sea burn threat from Hezbollah is a dirty bomb. Now, a dirty bomb is not necessary. Whenever you read about it, it is a weapon of mass destruction by definition, but casualty rates are not as high with a dirty bomb as it would be, obviously, a nuclear blast. Um, they're more of a economical um, weapon of mass destruction because the cleanup is enormous to clean up after a dirty bomb, to remove all of the radioactive particles that are spread throughout because the traditional explosive blew up the fissile material or the radioactive material and turned it into dust and or fragments, and it spread throughout an entire area. So the isotope that I point out is cesium-137. Cesium-137 is a radioactive material that is used to power CT scanners. We don't see it that often here in the United States because they've made an effort to get rid of them and house them properly and demolish of them properly. But in third world countries like the ones in Brazil and Paraguay and Argentina, these areas that are not as technologically sound as the United States would be or Europe still use these types of CT scanners where they have cesium-137. And all it would take is for a Hezbollah operative to somebody that is affiliated with with Hezbollah in the region to gain access or know what they were doing and extract the cesium-137 powder from the CT scanner It's housed in glass tubes, a glass type tube, um, and that's how it's used to power the CT scanner. But it's already a powder, and its radioactive signature uh, is a lot lower on a scanner than, say, uranium or plutonium would be, weapons grade material. But if somebody were to break open that powder capsule, the glass powder capsule with the cesium inside of it, they would die very quickly. It is very radioactive. It just does not give off a huge radioactive signature. So it makes it easier to smuggle, especially if you're trying to cause mass panic. And the fact that it is already a powder means that it you don't have a huge clunk or chunky pieces that can fly off or anything like that for discovery. It's already a powder. You attach it to an explosive, and the explosive and the wind does the rest. And depending on uh, where it was launched at, if we're talking downtown Manhattan on top of a building, and it doesn't even have to be an explosive. The Hezbollah operatives could climb to the top of a building and just dump the powder out, and it would still cause the same problem with the wind carrying it all around the city. Uh, and it could take a long time before the CDC and the United States government even knew what was going on. People would just start dropping from radioactive sickness, and it would take anywhere between 24 or 48 hours to pinpoint the source and establish a cleanup plan and an evacuation, and then the cleaning procedures and the medical facilities needed to take care of the people that were affected. Billions of dollars in infrastructure would have to be diverted and focused to cleaning up this. That is what they mean by a dirty bomb being a weapon of mass destruction. On the last dot, I put this down here because it is a possibility, but it isn't. It's kind of like the nuclear one, but for opposite reasons. Chemical and biological weapons. Um, Chemical weapons are a possibility. They are within the realm of possibility. But if they're trying to produce sarin gas or something of that magnitude, it takes technical skill and know-how. Am Shinrikyo spent months trying to establish a protocol and a way to um, to use sarin gas. They got off one attack, but ultimately, I mean, there were casualties, but it was not the grand plan that they originally had in mind for it, thankfully. Um, so it takes skill and know-how and of how to deploy it. Not only that, but if you have to have a container of sorts whenever you're launching a chemical weapon, because the wind can just blow it away, and it dilutes as it spreads. So it becomes harder, and it takes somebody with a lot of know-how to effectively wield chemical weaponry. Not saying it's impossible, but it is unlikely that Hezbollah would use that. Biological weapons, I thought would be a little bit higher on the probability scale, but once again, you come down to the infrastructure of producing enough of the proper granule size of a disease like anthrax that would be just big enough to be inhaled, um, but not so big that it would fall directly after it was released. There's a lot that goes into creating a biological weapon that can cause damage. Um, Once again, not saying it's impossible, but it is unlikely. Um, Moving on. So this actually just happened this last summer, 2019, and this is probably the most likely use of Hezbollah resources. Um, right now, the United States, no, everybody's afraid to point out any type of fingers or anything like that, and say this behavior is suspicious or anything like that, because they're afraid to be labeled as a racist or something of that nature. But this man immigrated to the United States in 2000. He became a naturalized citizen in the year 2005. Um, he was arrested this last July because he was collecting information and sending it back, and we believe, to Hezbollah leadership or Iranian leadership during the height of what was going on between the United States government and the Iranian government. Threats going back and forth. It was just a little bit before the most recent event of the drone strike in Saudi Arabia. Um, so he was caught scouting locations in, I would believe it's called the tri-state area. I'm not 100% sure. But in Fenway Park, the stuff that was collected on him indicated that he had done a reconnaissance of Fenway Park for a possible attack in Boston, the White House, and the surrounding government buildings, the Capitol building, museums, all of those, Lincoln Memorial, and locations in New York City for historical value, thanks to 9/11. So he was, like I said, arrested for that, and nobody suspected. There are pictures of him now that are surfacing from the internet of him actually with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and how this individual was able to immigrate to the United States, and not only immigrate to the United States, but become a citizen and not on anybody's watch list. It's a little concerning, but this would be the likely use of Hezbollah resources, is collecting information for potential attacks in the future. Um, the other possibilities of infiltration into the United States by Hezbollah is smuggling themselves across the southern border, the United States and Mexico border, and blending themselves in. They don't have to come over here the proper way as the guy in the last slide did. I wasn't able to find his name. I think they were still protecting it, but they could just come across, mixed and mingled with the migrants that come across the border every single day at the United States Mexico border. And there's a chance they would get caught, but there's also the possibility they could get through. And also, it's really hard to distinguish between someone of Lebanese descent and somebody that's a native to and that's Middle Eastern or Lebanese descent, and someone from Latino descent. It's really hard. There's a lot of similarities between the two cultures, and that's not to say, what if the person that is infiltrating grew up in the tri-border area and is half Lebanese and half native to the area, whatever nationality, Argentinian or Brazilian, something of that nature. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart from the other migrants that have crossed over. So they could, excuse me, easily come across in that way. And as I've said before, Hezbollah is unlikely to just out of nowhere place suicide bombers. They will, but it's unlikely. Um, Especially whenever you're talking about somebody that's just going to infiltrate the United States. It's hard enough task. They're not going to trust that to the people that they have martyred themselves for Islam. But it's not out of the realm of possibilities. And if they were to infiltrate, and depending on how many came across the southern border, and they were able to come across with their explosive vests, and none of them were discovered, and they just spread out through the entire United States, you're talking about something that could cause mass panic on a scale since 9/11, of people blowing themselves up in downtown Manhattan, Los Angeles, San Diego, and huge metropolitan areas around the country. And they could do it simultaneously and just cause mass panic. And that would be a probable threat to the United States. Um, Procedures to protect the United States from Hezbollah. The best way to counter Hezbollah is to increase intelligence uh, on the operations of the group and the ones that it's associated with, um, and by following Hezbollah movements. Also, following the activities of Iran, communication with Hezbollah in the tri-border area, see if there's an influx. We might not be able to actually penetrate calls, but we can definitely tell when there's an increase in communication between one country and another country, and we should definitely relocate some satellite assets in order to monitor that. Um, Another way would to be destroy the relationship that Hezbollah has with the drug trafficking organizations, which is a lot harder than it sounds, and we'll get into that here in a minute. Um, but those are the best ways to procedures, in a nutshell, very vague way to protect the United States. Um, the implementation of counterterrorism procedures against Hezbollah. Um, One of the options is, you don't see this too often whenever you're talking about counterterrorism, is where there's multiple agencies that typically go after two different targets that can focus on one. So the DEA specializes in drug enforcement. So their business is everything drug related to the cartels, their networks, how they work, everything. The CIA really focuses on counterterrorism, espionage, things across the country. So one way to follow Hezbollah's activities in the region, and if not destroy Hezbollah's relationship with the drug trafficking organizations, is first one, you have to identify um, who Hezbollah is doing business with, which cartels, um, and then you would have to get somebody to infiltrate these organizations on the cartel side and work their way on the inside towards the goal of being a liaison between the cartels and Hezbollah. Big drawback of this is, one, risk to the agent that is undercover. It could take years to gain that level of trust in a drug trafficking organization. Not only that, but the amount of time it would take for them to infiltrate, gain the position needed in order to become a liaison with Hezbollah. It could take years, if not longer. Another option would be to increase the SIGINT, IMINT, and HUMINT in the tri-border area. to gain intelligence on Hezbollah activities and operations. Now, this is probably already being taken care of by the CIA agents down in that area. But we could also step it up a little bit more, especially with the current threat between Iran and the United States and tensions. Another just blanket way to protect the United States is for Border Patrol agents to be trained in what to look for. They see thousands of faces every day, but they need to be able to identify between somebody that is of natural Latino descent, somebody that was born in Mexico, Honduras, or Panama, or in any of those other Central American countries, and somebody that could be of Lebanese descent. Um, it could just be as simple as being able to identify where the cheekbone is versus nose placement, something of that. But they should be able to identify the difference between the two cultures by looking at them. So that whenever they're scanning faces, they can, okay, this person's obviously Mexican. This person's Mexican. Wait a second, this guy, he doesn't look Mexican. He doesn't look Honduran. Let's talk to him for a minute. And let's see where he's actually from. That's provided they're able to catch the ones that are coming over. For any seaborne threat, border agents should be diligent and trained constantly to investigate anything unusual about powders, vials, containers that might hold potential WMD material. It's better. I know it costs money, but it's better to be wrong than to be watching the next 9/11 because you didn't feel and they didn't feel like they should check this woman's purse or actively investigate this toolbox or whatever. It should all be checked and rechecked, and they should also be trained in how to identify threats, which is what we're getting into now. Is um, they should scan all of the items whenever they actually they apprehend these individuals crossing the border illegally, especially away from checkpoints. Border Patrol agents should also be trained in the signs and symptoms of biological exposure to substances like anthrax. Smallpox is another possibility, low but possibility. What they should be looking for, the signs and the symptoms, and if somebody's showing signs and symptoms, they need to be isolated and they need to be put in isolation containment until a medical professional can come and verify whether or not they are actually infected or not, or if it's something else. As far as the man in New York that was captured, that by far is a great example of law enforcement doing what law enforcement should be doing. Is just being vigilant, especially in high population areas, because of the Taliban and its Taliban and Al Qaeda and its influence over the entire Islamic extremist world. A lot of terrorist organizations, they focus on the big cities that are most popular: New York, Washington D.C., Los Angeles. Those are the main cities that were identified in the Taliban's Al Qaeda's training manual by Osama bin Laden himself. And while Sunni and Shia don't like each other, they will use each other's material. Obviously, Hezbollah was the one that created and coined suicide bombing, and the Sunni Muslims followed suit. But law enforcement should really look for people that are looking and scouting areas that are not typical. And what I mean by this is water treatment plants, especially the ones for major cities, because all it would take is for somebody to slip a high enough dose or some sort of pathogen into the water, and we drink it, and then a bunch of people get sick. Um, Power plants. If you cut the power to a large metropolitan area, blackouts cause mass damage every single time that they happen, regardless of what city they're in, because people can't live without their power. We're talking hospitals, people on ventilator systems. Um, these are all possible casualties to this type of terrorist attack. Um, Gas distribution areas. Most people are familiar with the earthquake that happened in Northridge, California in 2014, November 2014. Um, I was part of the protection team that went out there to establish security for that underneath the Department of Homeland Security. And over the course of the 4 years that we were there until they got the gas leak completely contained or at least diverted, we caught two individuals that were scouting out that specific site. Now, this site provides roughly, I'm not even going to estimate, but I know it's in the millions of people in Los Angeles and even Orange County with their natural gas to heat their homes and hot water and all of that. Um, but he was scouting out this location. Now, if an explosive were to go off in the right spot, especially with that gas leak going on, um, and he was able to gain access through some way, shape, or form, just walking through and placing explosive, it could have been detrimental to the entire region. Not just the explosion that would have occurred, but the lack of heating. And we caught him during winter. Winters are not harsh in Southern California, but uh, that winter particularly was. But that was one of those instances where we saw the individual, we approached him, we realized what he was doing, we detained him for a period of time. We tried to get LAPD to come out and assist us, but there was something else that had their attention at the time. When we sent his information in, we actually got called back by the FBI office in Los Angeles that that individual was on a watch list. He was on an expired visa. He was Syrian and had known affiliations with ISIS, and they had been looking for him. And he was supposed to be, they were looking for him in Virginia, and he was in Southern California. So that's just one of those things where being vigilant and diligent in what people are doing and just watching what everybody's doing is very important. And as I said before, terrorist organizations focus on New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. So law enforcement agencies in those areas should have their own counterterrorism procedures and intelligence network. In conclusion, we have covered the origin of Hezbollah, the association that Hezbollah has with Iran, the development and growth of Hezbollah, how it's established power in Lebanon, its organizational capabilities in Lebanon, how Hezbollah became active in the tribal border area in South America, Hezbollah's relationship with drug traffickers in South America, and the potential threats that Hezbollah poses to the United States with what is going on with Iran, and the counterterrorism procedures that should be in place against Hezbollah activity. I thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. These are all of the references. Thank you very much.